Okay, so welcome to this edition of Cafe Conversations. My name is Daniel Phillips. I'm a professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy. I'm also the coordinator of the Knowing the Future curricular theme. So this is a set of professors, students who examine together issues of how we know what we know and how that then plays out in terms of how we predict the future. We span a broad range of disciplines, and there are many courses under the umbrella of the theme. So right now we're running our first year class, which is called Knowing What We Know, and today's guest speaker in class was Professor Joshua Sosin, and we made him do double duty and come here and also present a cafe conversation. So Professor Sosin is a professor of classics and history at Duke University. He also has a joint appointment with the library there at Duke, where he runs the Duke Collaboratory for Classics Computing, right? Very good. I'll let him explain the acronym in a couple of minutes. So Professor Sosin is a world expert on the subject of papyri, but more broadly, I think what he does is very interesting for what it says, about what we can and cannot know about antiquity, and also for the way that he's developed and is exploiting tools for collaboration using digital methods to access these very ancient texts. I want to emphasize that this is meant to be a conversation, so please, if you have questions, ask away. As you'll discover, Professor Sosin likes to interact with the audience, and so I think we'll have fun. So please, Professor Sosin.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? So I'm... Very low. So I'm teaching a class right now in ancient Greek oratory, and we're reading court speeches that were delivered in ancient Athens in Greece, and I told my students I can't be there on Thursday for your exam because I'm driving to Athens, and didn't provide any more information than that, and I'm not really sure what they thought. So I'm Josh Sosin. I'm from Duke University, from the Department of Classical Studies and History, and also the library, where I run a little software development group called the Duke Collaboratory for Classics Computing, which is a mouthful, but the point was to get the acronym DC-3, named after the airplane, which was called a collection of parts flying in loose formation, and that's the way our team tries to operate. So I want to do two things today. One, give you a little bit of an introduction to a discipline you might never have heard of called papyrology, which the HTC students who are here in the room just saw, so it will be okay when they're sleeping at that point. And then to pivot from that to a brief consideration of some of the web-facing tools that we've been building in order to support this kind of scholarly inquiry, and a bit of thinking out loud on what the future of such tools may hold for us, what some of the benefits of them are, what some of the problems associated with trying to mount them are. Okay? I don't have a little clicker, so I'm going to have to turn my back to you occasionally. Okay, so there is a reed that grew in antiquity almost exclusively on the banks of the Nile River called the papyrus. You can still sometimes see papyrus plants in an arboretum. It's a dwarf variety of them. But the papyrus plant was a reed with a triangular stalk, rather like a prism, whose bottom 32 centimeters or so were suitable for the making of paper. And our word paper comes from the ancient word papyrus. The way you did this was you very carefully shaved strips of papyrus, about a centimeter wide, and laid them next to each other like this, and then very carefully shaved more strips and laid them at 90 degrees on top of that, and then pounded the heck out of the material with a rock such that the cell walls break and the goo oozes out, which serves as a kind of natural glue. You press the stuff, you dry the stuff, you polish it with sand or with stone, and you have a very durable, very smooth writing material. The papyri that we read today survived more or less intact for 2,000 years under the ground, such that we can read them today. On these materials are written a wide array of documents in a wide array of languages. The things that I'm going to be talking about today start in roughly the 4th century BC and run up through the 8th or 9th centuries AD, and are written in Greek. In the late 4th century, the Greek kingdom of the Ptolemies conquered and colonized Egypt, and from that point forward, the documentation of daily life and governing and of the ruling class was written in ancient Greek, which some people can read. Of course, we can read the parts that are preserved on this papyrus. This particular one was extracted from a kind of paper mache that was used to make a mummy casing. There were priests who got special contracts to embalm and encase dead bodies. And in order to save costs, they would go around to local shops and offices of government and buy up the waste paper at a bargain price and make it into a paper mache case. So it's not often, it is frequently the case that when you walk into a museum and you see a beautiful painted, lacquered mummy case, I see something that I would very much like to stick in a bathtub with water and melt down in order to extract these texts. Now, as I said, there is significant challenge associated just with reading these things, and not because some parts of them, not only because some parts of them are missing, but because ancient Greek is just hard to cope with. You have a question?
I do. So you talked about the paper. What did they use for ink?
Great. So they used carbon-based ink, and this was, so antiquity didn't have any of these things, right? There weren't lights. If you wanted to light a room, you had to light a fire, preferably in a lamp, and which meant a wick with, through which you burned oil. And the oil that was used, the oil of choice in Egypt, was castor oil. And my advisor in the 1960s at an international congress of papyrologists did an experiment where he said, we're going to make some lamp black. And so with all of the nerds gathered in the room from countries near and far, they gathered round the lamp that had castor oil in it, and he lit the wick. And I don't know whether you've ever smelled burning castor oil. Yeah, everyone ran out of the room instantly. Anyway, a soot builds up, and you collect it, and you mix it with water and make a paste, and you have ink. Iron gall-based inks don't emerge until centuries later. But anyway, you have to be able to read this material, and there are a lot of things standing against you. It takes several years to get really pretty good at ancient Greek, but the ancient Greek that you read on a page has punctuation, has breaks between the words, has standard spelling, has standard grammar, has standard orthography, and none of this does. You have to be able to cope with the ancient artifact. You have to be able to decipher the letters that are written on the papyrus. You have to then be able to construe it into something that all of you who can read ancient Greek know how to recognize, with spaces between the words, with punctuation helping you out. But you also have to read parts that aren't there, because these things, remember, were buried in the ground for a long time and don't survive in a condition that is ready-made for us to just jump into. Here you have the very top of the document, which includes the name of the addressee, which turns out to be a crucial piece of information. This often lets you know the context in which a document was written, the date in which it was written, and here the guy's name is missing. So if you want to read that part that's gone, you have to be able to read the bits and pieces that are adjacent around it. And if you use the research tools that are available to us and you practice at this long and hard for the $6.25 an hour that we all make, you can read it. And you know that this text was addressed to a guy called Agathis, and you know that he was the governor of a particular region at a particular time, and there's no other guy carrying that name and the titles associated with him. And so you can, in effect, read the stuff that has been lost through the ravages of time. Sometimes you get lucky. The lighting's not real good here, but trust me, this is the kind of document that, students who are just getting into this see and wave their arms like, this is great, this is totally readable. Every word is entirely clear. Sometimes you get sort of lucky. This document here is something like 40 centimeters tall and is written in a really beautiful, you have to trust me on this, calligraphic hand. It's all there. If you can master the script, this is a choice find in a very readable text. We're not always so lucky. Most of the time, we're not so lucky. This is much more like what you often get. It's not an artifact of the lighting that middle is all garbaged out and illegible. This is the typical state of preservation of a text. the payoff can be really worth it when a text is legible and gives up for us its contents. Here's a letter from a guy called Hilarion to his sister. Sister was a term of affection used of a spouse, and brother when going in the other direction. He writes, many greetings, hope you're all right. I'm still in Alexandria, the big city. I'm going to go later. I'm going to send my pay when I get to it. And by the way, if you give birth to a son, excellent. If you give birth to a daughter, cast it out. See ya. Right? That's the letter. This is a letter from a husband to a wife, and he's out of town, and she's about to give birth, and he knows it, and he's offering her advice on what to do with the child depending on its gender. Save it if it's a boy, expose it if it's a girl. Yeah, question?
If the writing is like really faded in the middle, like you said, is there a way that you can like chemically or things like that?
Yes. Not chemically, right? It's not. The question is, so what happens when you have one of these texts that's all beaten up in the middle and you can't really see the ink anymore? Is there anything you can do to that in order to recover it? I'll show you an image of what you can do in a second. What you don't want to do is apply any kind of chemicals, but what you can do is apply certain kinds of lighting. We'll come to that in a second. These texts open a window for us on what real life was like for people who were perhaps too poor to keep all children, regardless of their gender, when they're born. And it shows us the sort of casual way in which something that would be absolutely heart-wrenching and life-wrecking for us to contemplate had to have been handled. Yes?
The year of this, which Caesar are they talking about?
The 29th year of Caesar. Antiquity used an era dating system at various places and times. We use an era dating system. This is a dating system that has a notional year one, right, that begins at some point. In the Roman Empire, the era reset with each new emperor, right? So if you want an answer to that, first you have to know how many emperors managed to last 29 years? The answer is very, very few. I don't think anyone lasted longer than, I think it's almost certainly Augustus. There certainly can't be very many who made it that long. It's a great question. The payoff can be really, really worth it. This one is quite hard to see. The text is beautiful and quite intact, and here it is slightly larger. I won't read the whole thing, and you might try in the time that it takes me to describe it, but it seems it's some kind of document. We're not sure. It might be a testimony that was entered into evidence in a court case. We're not even sure. But it is written by a woman describing the absolute horrors visited on her and the entire household by an abusive husband, including torturing and branding slaves in the house and locking them up in the basement, and when she's off at church, changing the keys to the house. It's absolutely appalling. Things like this happened in antiquity, and we get insight into them through the papyri. These things preserve for us contracts and private letters and tax returns and dinner invitations and hate mail and divorce agreements and recipes and on and on and on. If you can think of it, there's a good chance that something like this is preserved on papyrus. We have a whole archive of the dreams as remembered by a hypochondriac who locked himself in a temple for many years and under advice of the priests wrote down his dreams every day. And I promise you, they are as crazy as you would think they'd be. They legitimately sound like dreams. So let's pause for a second. I'm told that we have 3 hours. So let's pause for a second and run a little exercise. We'll come to your banned chemical substances in a minute. And I want you to think for a second about something that you can imagine appearing on paper, the kind of paper that you traffic in daily, that you carry around in your pocket, that you find under the cushions in your couch in the car, right? So think for a minute and then ask me whether something like that is preserved for us on papyrus today, now. And if any of you were in HTC a minute ago and I said something was a particularly good suggestion, you're not allowed to ask it here. The very first thing that was asked in HTC is doodles. Yes, we have an array of doodles. We have marginalia written in the sides of literary texts. We have little notes on documents. We have pictures, people who were clearly bored. We have poems with pictures of the poem. We have pornographic, threatening and disturbing doodles on papyrus. We have a wide array of that. Great question. What else? Yeah, shoot. Events of the day. What falls under that category? We have things like diaries, that's for sure. We have records of news events. So, not so much. We have circulars announcing from government agents announcing new policy. News tended to be conveyed by word of mouth, not in writing. This paper was cheap, but not that cheap. It would have to be much, much cheaper in order to support that kind of thing. Yes, here and then here. Shopping lists. Yes, we have lots of shopping lists. We have local shopping lists. Go into town, buy the lentils, buy the chickpeas, buy some other stuff. We also have some really fantastic shopping lists that agents of state gave to flunkies of theirs who were going to be traveling throughout the Mediterranean on official business with requests that they bring back certain stuff, right? So I definitely want the glass from southeast Turkey. They make the best glass, and pick up a couple of horses for me when you're in Syria. And that allows us to build up a sense of what international trade looked like. Good. What else? Oh, yes, I forgot. Obituaries. Not so much, because we don't have like news venues in which those exist. We have death notices, but these were generally for the purpose of freeing a family from the obligation of paying the tax on the person who no longer lives.
And a twist on that, how about a KIT contract?
A what contract?
KIT contract, some town says, go and kill this person.
Yeah, no, that's an easy one. No, we don't have that. No, absolutely not. We have receipts in large number. Receipts for paying taxes, receipts for paying rents, all kinds of receipts, absolutely. Medical advice. We have recipes for how to make particular medicine. We have instructions for performing certain kinds of medical operations. So not so much advice, but all kinds of documents that bear on medical procedure, for sure. Yeah, great. Picture books. Yeah, so this is a really interesting thing. Go hop on a plane this weekend and travel around Turkey and Greece and that sort of thing, and go to museums, and what you'll find is that architecture looks very similar. Statues look very similar. Paintings, to the extent that you can find them, look very similar. It's quite clear to art historians that an awful lot of this enterprise was driven by sample books, which you could buy on the market. Things that had pictures of like, well, this is the way you depict the scene of Zeus doing so-and-so, and it's been done in this temple, and there's like a line drawing sketching it out. And you can base your work on that. And we have occasional little bits of these. We have occasional very precious little bits of drawings of maps, but unfortunately not in great number. We do have some. Religious texts in huge number. Papyri tend to survive from contexts in which there was a real and abiding interest of preserving information for some subsequent use. And one of the things that temples did was hold precious objects, which means they had to keep track of them, which means they wrote them down. So we have some of these things. And had to know who dedicated this or that. Temples also served as the banks of antiquity, which meant they had to keep track of money going in and coming out. Often this is included. Temples owned land, and land produces food, which you can sell for money. So absolutely. This might seem more like the business side of religion than you might have had in mind, but theology is often something that doesn't get recorded on paper, whereas, like, where's the silver candlestick is something you write down.
How about recipes, including recipes for how to dye fabrics, royalty had different colors?
Yeah. Recipes about dyeing, dyeing fabric. I don't know. That's a great question. Color was something that was really important in antiquity, and therefore dyeing was. But I don't actually know that one. Yeah. Yes, notes taken by students. We have, there is a fantastic book that collects all the known examples surviving on wooden tablets and broken potsherds and pieces of papyrus of writing exercises that students did. Okay, I think one more. Concert posters, flyers. So, not so much that, but we do have documents announcing that there was going to be a dinner on the occasion of some religious festival, place and time mentioned. These are generally more like invitations than posters. For the most part, you brought friends over rather than everybody come. This kind of venue didn't so much exist. All right? So I want to pan from here, if it's okay, to some of the tools that we build in order to support this kind of work online. So starting in 1982, Duke University built a repository of the texts that exist on these papyri. 1982 was 1,000,000 years ago as far as computers concerned. I was 10, all right? Pan forward a bunch of years, and there are a whole bunch of projects that have sort of grown up in a herky-jerky fashion that have to do in some way with these materials. So at Duke, we were collecting the text. In Heidelberg, they were collecting information about these texts, where they were from, when they were from, what they were concerning, who they mentioned. A project called the Advanced Papyrological Information System was creating digital images of these texts, of which there are some 500,000 around on Earth today. A group in Brussels was putting together bibliography concerning them, and a group in Leuven was putting together all kinds of crazy information. So we decided that what we ought to do was bolt all these different resources together, which is, it turns out, a crazy, difficult, and expensive proposition. But this is what we did, and you can see here, we've pulled together, this is that first text from Hilarion to his wife. And you see at the beginning, in German, because that's what they speak in Heidelberg, information concerning the text. You can see the information about people and places and the date that Leuven controls. You can see the catalog record that the museum in Toronto has generated concerning this material. You can see the bibliographical references that we've mined out of the database. You can see here the Greek text in a form that all of you can read, the image down below it, and the translation that you all saw a second ago. All right? So we took all of these projects that grew up sort of on their own and stitched them all together so that there is a kind of one-stop shop for doing this kind of research online. Okay. This piece of papyrus, as I mentioned a second ago, is something that was buried underground for 2,000 years. You pull it out, dust it off, and you can still read it. It is highly durable. It is fairly inexpensive. Not now. Then it was. It is self-contained. If you can read it, you probably know what it means and what the significance of it was. It is fairly easily disseminated. You make a copy, put it in the mail. Now make a Xerox, scan the thing. It's fairly easily reused. You copy out a sentence and put it in another document. It will survive cultural discontinuity, right? This thing survived the end of antiquity, the end of the Middle Ages, till now. It is tough. This, by contrast, the thing that we built, the thing that pulls together all of the main web resources for studying in this space, is totally fragile, is wildly expensive, is deeply networked, which means if one person gets cranky and decides to change the standard, the whole thing can come crashing down. It's disseminated with considerable effort. You have to have an internet connection. It's somewhat easily reused, and this will not survive cultural discontinuity. When we cease to have power, this will be gone. There is no version of this that lives safely under the sand where 2,000 years from now someone can access it. So there are really profound risks with racing forward in the digital scholarship space. Now, in some cases, these risks are totally worth it because there's no way to do the work otherwise. This is to come, you can't see this very well. On the left, there is a chunk of papyrus with no visible text. You cannot see it. Trust me on this. On the right, there is a chunk of text that is totally visible. And this is because we were able to subject this image to what's called multispectral imaging, this papyrus, which involves capturing multiple images under different lighting conditions and then adjusting the values that you see down through the stack of images. And this particular one happens to respond very, very well at the 940 nanometer range, which allows us, without applying any chemicals, I feel like I'm selling something here with this microphone. This allows us, without applying any chemicals, to recover text that otherwise you wouldn't be able to see at all. So there are cases, there's no way to do this without the mediation of technological modalities. Here, I think this is pretty clear. That's what it looks like. The thing on the image on the left is what it looks like when you get up very close to this piece of 4th century leather that contains a number of Old Testament tracts. I forget which one this is, but you can see that under ultraviolet light, the text is dead clear. If you can read Hebrew, you can totally cope with this text, right? There is no non-technological means of doing this because we do not all have squid eyes, right? We can't see in this range. Okay. Turning a little bit. So over the last more than a century, we've built up a really fairly robust model for building book-like things, right? For building static means of delivering information about some particular subject and paying people to do it. So I'm a professor, I get like $6 an hour, I write a book, probably by myself. I don't have to look after the care and feeding of that book forever after because other libraries are going to buy it and people are going to buy it. And in my field, that means there are going to be like 70 copies in circulation in the world. And then the library just has to make sure that like the air conditioning doesn't go down and the roof doesn't leak, and the book will probably be fairly safe. And the marginal cost of keeping the building watertight per book is really low, probably less than a penny. Libraries contain hundreds and hundreds of thousands of books. I write the book, I probably forget about the book afterwards and move on to the next one. Scholars cite the book, and that doesn't affect the book that I wrote. If scholars decide they don't care about my book anymore and they're going to ignore it, that's okay. Probably not every single library is going to throw it out, which means 1,000 years later, somebody will get their hands on some copy of that book. If my library decides that stupid book and throws it out, I don't care. Probably the other 74 libraries didn't do the same. Dynamic web things, so the entire academic enterprise is built around that set of rules and facts to do with books. Dynamic web things are entirely different. My university doesn't pay me, I get grant money, and I hire an army of developers, and they build something which we then give away, and then they go get other jobs. Now, I can't just forget about this thing forever after because software changes and standards change, and this thing has to be migrated forever after. It has to be enhanced. Somebody has to turn it back on when a user writes in and says, the thing's broken, it doesn't work anymore. somebody has to think about this resource daily. It's not like a book, which you write and then forget. It's like a child who you give birth to and then will never leave your house, ever, right? Scholars, not only that, if you build something open, they're not just going to cite the book, the resource, they might actually come in and change the data. So you have to be able to reflect that forever after. If users start ignoring my resource, the host, which has to pay a lot of money just to keep the thing going, to keep the machines running, is probably going to pull the plug. And if the host decides, you know what, we don't really care about your web resource anymore, that's it. It's kaput. It is not at all like a book. It is much more fragile and much more precarious. And this is the direction we're all driving in today. Books are fairly cheap, and we probably make way too many of them. Dynamic web things are wildly expensive, and we probably make way too few of them. Right? It doesn't take a genius to see that the answer here is gobs and gobs and gobs of money. I have no idea how to get it, by the way. I'm optimistic because I think on the one side, what we mainly have to do to get out of this hole of producing static print things is effectively to change the policy. Right? If word were to come down from on high from a number of leading universities in America, on the planet, that, you know what, from here on out, we're not simply going to credit the book as the sole mechanism of conveying scholarly information, but we're actually going to reward building this kind of stuff. And we're going to start trying to find money in order to support it and sustain it, people would follow. All we really need to do to affect change on the dynamic web thing side is to come up with untold gigantic sums of money to completely change the way we hire people and staff projects, and also come up with lots of money, and to completely reframe the way we handle hiring and tenure and promotion and institutional collaboration, and come up with gobs and gobs of money. In other words, if we only just reinvent everything, we'll solve this second bit. But I think if we don't, then we're going to be running down this road of producing lots and lots of fancy stuff that won't even almost have the chance of preservation down the road that these flimsy little bits of papyrus do, that we can still read and use and talk about and be interested in today. All right? So I'm happy to take questions, contributions, whatever you have. I'm selling, after all.
Very great talk. Thank you very much for coming to this Athens to speak with us. Digital is a great way to disseminate information. I'm sure you work with archiving as well. Two questions. Who decides what gets kept? Because a lot of your, or maybe one large question, a lot of the text you can't read within the field, or when it first comes to the DC3. So how do you know what texts are relevant and what are not? And also the storage of all this, because, you know, the reason for the digital, you said there were 500,000
Yep.
pieces possibly on. You probably have 2 or 3 million stored, and you're getting more, you know, almost every day. When do you decide what to throw out, or when do you say, I don't have enough room because this whole section's full and we can't keep text, and this next text may be, you know, something really important, but you can't see it.
So did you all hear that question? How do you decide what you keep? How do you decide about the space to support all this, both physical space to hold the objects and virtual space in order to hold the digital surrogates of these? And how do you decide what's relevant? These are excellent questions that are both very simple and very complicated. The simple answer to how do you decide what's relevant is that's not your job. You have it, you preserve it. You leave it for someone else to decide whether it's relevant, because you know what? These texts that we couldn't read 15 years ago, you might think are irrelevant. But when the technology arises that allows you to recover them, you may discover that they are relevant, right? So the archivist and the conservator has to imagine a way, whatever aspiration they have to be the decider about such things, and say, my job is to be steward, and try to leave this object or its digital surrogate in the best possible situation for someone else one day in order to find what's relevant in it. You will run out of space, both for the physical objects and for the digital surrogates. We haven't hit that wall yet. Right now, storage is still relatively cheap. I don't know when that's going to change. On the other hand, we're just one tiny field, and the storage needs of libraries are just increasing astronomically. At some point, we're going to hit the wall. And at some point, places are going to have to make those decisions. But guess what? Libraries have always made these kinds of tough decisions. Never has there been an organization on Earth who pursued a sustainable policy that we keep everything at all costs. It's just not possible. You do your best to try to avoid it. You use technology to help you when you can, and you try to make clear to people who have money to support this kind of endeavor that if you want to be serious about this, it's an entirely different game from building a warehouse that you put books in. So it's complicated and yet in some ways fairly stark.
As you work with students today, they're much more comfortable with the ubiquity, I guess, of digital media. But there's also something about the tactile nature, the touch of an ancient manuscript.
Yep.
How do you, do they see that? Is that being valued? I mean, we can give the information, that's one thing.
Right.
But there's a whole tactile kinesthetic sort of thing of communication.
Yeah, that's right. You all hear that question? Students today are real comfortable accessing things on the screen, but they're missing something because they don't get to actually touch that 2,000-year-old object in your hand. The short answer is that's totally true. And we face that same kind of divide in, for example, online education, which allows you to pipe certain information through the web to the user's terminal where they can consume it, but it's a much narrower bandwidth, right? They're not standing this close to the professor. They're not looking in the eyes and understanding that they're being heard, right? So you can convey something, but not everything. I think the benefit of disseminating more of what we've got to people who might not be able to afford to fly to Vienna to go into the basement to look at the objects, that is an unquestionable good. If you're consuming it that way only and not getting the experience of touching it and feeling it and seeing how it works and raking it like this to try to catch the exact right light in order to read it, you're missing a lot. But it's far better to give as much as we can, to use the technology to give as much as we can to as many people as we can. In other words, the sin is in completely replacing the in-person tactile experience, not also using this other means, I think.
How do you balance that at your institution?
Yeah.
I assume they can go to the archive.
Well, we are fortunate enough to own almost 1,500 of these objects, which means our students are able to handle them. To be clear, we don't actually let them handle the papyri. They're handling the papyri wedged between two pieces of glass, and for obvious and good reasons. But we're fortunate enough to be able to do that. There are more sort of small collections around the world that hold these things than you might think. By the way, I have no notion of the time, so I'm just going to rely on you to tell me to shut up when it's time. Yeah. Is there? That's fantastic. Can you tell me about it?
Well, I've seen it. It's under a piece of cellophane, right? It's Greek. It's Egyptian, and
Uh-huh.
it's got retarded.
Uh-huh.
It's third century.
Uh-huh. Do you work for the library? Uh-huh. Okay. Cool. I'm very glad to know. There's a piece of papyrus on display in the library, but we're not sure what's on it.
You indicated for the web-based thing to work, the university would have to reinvent itself. How optimistic are you that could happen in the next couple of years?
So
Nature University.
I have a friend who is a quantum computer scientist, right? And he says that he's quite certain that his plan for quantum computing is going to be the right one, and that he will know that 50 years after he's dead. So I don't really know. The basic problem here is that lots and lots of people are under the misapprehension that digital made everything cheaper. This is not just a little bit wrong. It couldn't be more wrong. Digital made everything wildly more expensive. And we just haven't caught up with that. Remember, we're just in the early years of trying to face that inversion. So I don't know what it looks like. But I mean, I can tell you that our resource cost about $2.25 million to build. And we have a staff of 2 full-time software developers keeping everything running, right? So that's a non-trivial expense. It's way more than even the most expensive book ever costs, right?
So I want to push just a little bit on this idea of fragility because I think it's really interesting. So we all know, in one sense, obviously, as you said, if the power goes out, right, we lose all things. But
Right.
in another sense, as we have come to find out in a number of cases recently, the internet is forever. In the sense that information gets out there and you can't get rid of it as hard as you try because it gets disseminated to so many
Right.
millions of users, right?
Right.
So I guess my question is, do you think that a shift in the paradigm of how information is stored rather than a single post, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That is potentially fragile.
Right.
If we can shift our sort of default paradigm to a kind of distributed model, right, that seems to me that would really combat the sort of fragility that we're worried about.
So yes and no. Not in the first case you mentioned, which is what happens when the power goes out. When the power goes out, what you described just, it isn't true. That's the end of forever, right? Unless we have printed stuff out. So we're doing this now with what's called linked open data. You know, that stuff that I showed you that pulls together information from a host of different resources. They have their own sites, they're up and running, and we have regularly scheduled exchanges of information and all of that. We're not reckless about this. We're keeping lots of copies all over the place. We take regular snapshots of all the data. We're following all best practices. We're giving ourselves the best possible shot that we have, okay? But a lot of what happens on a site like that is a dynamic process rather than a simple reflection of static data, right? There's a lot that goes on here that you couldn't print out, right? There is a graph at the heart of this, a property graph that defines all the relationships between these different pieces of the puzzle. It's not like an Excel sheet that you can print out, right? So there is no future-proof, fail-safe printout gesture that you can do for dynamic functionality. We can do our best to save the raw data and the stuff that defines how the data interoperates so that somebody might later figure out how to bolt it all together. But that's not fail-safe. It's just kind of the best we can do. So you're right, and the best projects are operating in this domain. A whole lot of are operating this way in this domain. A whole lot of projects aren't, because to do everything rigorously in that fashion is incredibly expensive, and it's just a blocker. Yeah. And then over here.
So I think, thanks for this talk, because I think it really articulates very well the fragility of these digital objects versus the preservation aspects of them. But I know some institutions have made a stab at solving this by creating institutional repositories.
That's right.
And that is large-scale digital archives, usually operated in conjunction with, you know, the technology departments, the research departments, and the libraries. And there are these kind of buckets
Yep.
in which content is submitted and then institutionally stewarded, presumably in perpetuity. So what do you think about that as
Yeah.
a solution?
So when we first started this, one of the first things we did was contact somebody who operates a large dark archive, which is a repository that promises that whatever you put in will be able to extract 50 years later. But you can't touch anything once it's in the archive. That is, it's the most draconian, strictest means of ensuring usability, some measure of usability down the road. And the cost, I can't even remember anymore, but it would make you cry. Like, the cost of just doing, of guaranteeing the least degree of functionality over 50 years is shocking, right? I'm not trying to be a Debbie Downer. This is all hard. You can deposit the data in the archive, but the data has to be served up by a suite of software which has to be kept current all along the way. And there's no repository that promises to steward forever code, right? Because, I mean, they would just run out of money and person power instantly. So what they're talking about providing for the long-term preservation of are data. It's a simpler proposition, and even that is expensive. So you're right, people are doing, and they're doing their best. I don't mean to give any impression otherwise, but I just mean to say this is an extremely difficult and expensive proposition to do right.
Taking you off topic, I mean, I understand the need for digitization of the papyrus. Great, accessibility, working together, et cetera. But I want to talk about in the future, because I think that you have expertise in this. So we talked about how digitization has the issue of fragility. But realistically, when we write things on paper now, the inks that we use, the papers that we use, they're pretty fragile too, as compared to a papyrus, aren't they? So if you had to come up with some scheme where you said 1,000 years from now, just like you're looking at the old papyrus, I want to be able to look at the records from today.
Yeah,
What would you say we should do?
build a time machine.
Okay, talking about expensive. But
I mean-
realistically, what can we do that we are or not doing to preserve our own culture now? We could have a lost culture.
Well, so most of the product of every culture that has ever been has been lost, and that's not likely ever to change. It's a tough enough question to deal with those things that we know we already have an obligation to look after. I would not want to be a librarian archivist today dealing with modern materials. The flood of them is just too great. Many of these things will last a lot longer because of stuff we know better now about ink chemicals and paper composition and all of that. There's a lot of stuff that we just don't do anymore for the things we think we want to hold on to. But the vast sea of stuff that we have to deal with now, it's just bigger and more varied. I wouldn't want that job, right? Like, it's just, I don't know how to answer that question. I'm sorry. Yes, please. Oh, and then over here.
Going back to actual papyrus, have you encountered any languages that you've never seen before? Or are they all Greek or Aramaic or?
Yeah, so, I mean, we have on papyrus several forms of Egyptian. We have Greek, we have Aramaic, we have Hebrew, we have troglodytic, we have, there's a wide array. So the short answer, have I seen languages that I don't personally know on the papyrus? Oh, yes. Have we found on papyrus languages that no one knows? We find these in inscribed contexts. On the papyri, I'm not sure. If so, these are not numerous objects. Yeah, Philip.
I was wondering about payoff for the effort to build the archive. Like, so, I just wondered if you had some numbers on over like accessibility in an archive institution.
Yeah.
And then speed up of
Yeah,
translation and interpretation.
yeah,
So you have like Moore's law for compiling
Yeah.
translation versus time.
yeah, so that's great. So the question is, all right, so you spent all this time and money building this thing, which puts it in front of anyone on Earth. Do you have any indication that it was worth it? That's a fair question. So, yeah. No, but that's the question. It's a good one. It's the question, right? If we ever want to get another dollar, we better be able to show that it was, right? The short answer is yes, unambiguously. So this site that we built doesn't just disseminate these materials. It allows anyone to comment on them. There are maybe a couple hundred highly active professional papyrologists in the world, all right? We have 600 registered users who log in and touch these texts, right? There are 3 times as many people who are interested in messing with these things than there are professionals active in the field. If you count them up, there are many more graduate students and even undergraduates who are making small but measurable contributions to knowledge through correcting a small error or translating a text that hasn't been translated before. We have a board of editors that vets all suggestions that come in. And that board is bigger, more diverse by gender and by specialty than the editorial board of any academic journal you could ever show me, right? We have editors who are graduate students passing judgment on proposed emendations by their professors, right, in the system. And it works. We've created something that is more open, more civil, more diverse. It's not actually faster, right, in many ways. But it is, by all these other measures of value, an incredible winner. Yes? You guys fight.
Just following up on that, because you gave the scholar's answer to value.
Yeah.
We are looking at higher ed being put in position these days of cost-benefit analyses, of career readiness. Can you give a value to that? Because you're dealing, as you said, with a very small number of scholars worldwide, really, who are your regular users. So at some point in time, is Duke going to pull the plug?
So the question is, this is expensive. Money is drying up in academia. What happens when a university that hosts something like this decides, it's real nice, we like you, but we can't afford it? I don't really know what the answer is, what happens. I mean, we have stuff in place. We have agreements with other organizations that promise to do their level best to take our data and host it. And we have reciprocal promises that we've extended to them. But if nobody has any cash, those promises don't matter. So I don't really know. In a way, what you're asking is, how does any scholarly discipline make the case to the world that the stuff they do is of abiding value? And I think that's an easy case to make. That doesn't mean we have the cash, but it's an easy case to make. This is a letter from a husband to his wife talking in casual fashion about the abandonment of their child, because they made the decision that we can afford to feed a boy but not to feed a girl. And he's on a business trip and writes home. This opens a window on a culture that is in some ways so crazily remote from anything, fortunately, that you or I experience daily, but which a lot of people in the world today still face, right? So it is at once completely proximate and completely distant. And if we ever reach the point that you have to, with a straight face, say, it's important to understand that people throughout various times and places in the world have been poorer than you can imagine, and we have a trove of documents that will open a window on their daily experience, right? If you have to argue for that, the game's up anyway, right? So whether every institution is going to be able to afford to float stuff like this forever after, the answer is certainly no. Who's going to carry the ball? Whether there are going to be fewer of them in the future, whether it's going to be in more distributed fashion, I'm not sure. But I sure hope I never live to see the day when it's just considered irrelevant. Yeah.
What's the oldest approximate that you all have in the work repository? Because I know you showed there was a collaboration of a lot of, let's say, within the DC.
Right. So I don't know, but I'll tell you how to find the answer. Go to papyri.info, click search, go to, on the left side where the faceted search abilities are, pull down the date drop down, and the earliest date we have there is the earliest century, like by century, that we have a papyrus. Yeah, here and then here, and at some point we're probably running out of time.
I'm just curious, from your reading of these ancient papyri, do you have a feeling for what was lost when the library at Alexandria was destroyed?
Well, not this stuff. What was lost was overwhelmingly literary rather than documentary materials. Unless I'm wildly wrong about that, I don't think I am. I don't think that it served as an archive for documentary materials. The array of stuff that was lost in tragedies like that is like staggering. We have a fraction of 1% of what was written, which is just tiny, tiny, tiny. On the other hand, there are huge troves of it that not very many people read even today. Do you know what the greatest surviving author in Greek from antiquity is? Anyone? Galen, who was a medical writer and whose collected works fill 3, 4, 5 shelves like this. I bet almost no classicist has read more than 1% of Galen, right? So it's a tragedy that we've lost all this stuff. On the other hand, we're a bunch of bums who haven't even read the stuff that this does survive. Yeah. The last question.
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask, so of course digital preservation, like fully digital, is admittedly really expensive, but I'm wondering if you think it's a step forward from the problems we run into with things we've seen with format wars, where we're looking at other means of storing data, like floppies, CDs, physical hard drives.
Yeah.
Where very quickly, even within a decade, it becomes so obsolete that there's no technology around here to read it.
That's right.
Is the expense of going fully digital with the acknowledgement that you have staff really managing it, right? Is that a step forward from having to deal with constantly outdated formats?
Well, I don't. Do you mean the decision to abandon paper altogether would so galvanize us into pouring our best and brightest individuals and our most precious dollars into solving the problem of forward migration that we'll just do it?
I mean, just in looking at technological progression, right, we've seen competing technologies. We're essentially talking about data storage. Right? So we've seen just in the past 25 years many different types of data storage.
Yeah.
Right? Some of them last a very short amount of time.
Correct.
Supplanted by later versions, right?
Yeah.
But since we've gotten to the point very recently where everything is going digital, right? We see this with movies, for instance. We've got VHS, DVD, Blu-ray, and now they're just digital.
Yeah.
Just on vertical storage. And similarly with many other kinds of data, right?
Right.
Is that better than trying to deal with this constant progression of physical storage mediums that constantly get outdated?
Well, I think it is if I understand you, I think it is in some ways better, but I think the problem, I think there is no future in which storage and operationalization standards don't change and improve, right? The only future in which the cost of stewardship forever goes away is the future in which no standards ever change. That is not a realistic future, which means that even if we just decide we're just going to go at this whole hog, we're still going to run up against the problem that stuff needs to be migrated, not just how you store it, but how you operationalize it, right? How you get functionality out of it, because we don't want to just look at data. We want to do things with it, right? And I don't see that problem ever going away, right? So the short answer is yes, it contributes to a solution, but it doesn't solve it by any stretch. Well, thank you very much for your patience.